She was the most graceful woman Hollywood had ever seen. Millions admired her. 2 men married her. Dozens wanted her. But in her final months, weak and dying from cancer, Audrey Hepburn did something nobody expected. She named the one man she could never get over. It was not a husband, not a co-star, not a lover. It was someone who broke her heart before she ever stepped in front of a camera. When people heard the name Audrey Hepburn, they pictured one thing: elegance, a black dress, pearl earrings, a cigarette holder, eyes that carried something quiet and deep. She moved through every room like she had been born knowing exactly how to belong there. Hollywood loved her. Audiences worshipped her. Directors fought for the chance to put her in front of a camera. But here is what almost nobody stopped to ask. Where did that look come from? Not the dress. Not the pearls. The look behind the eyes. That stillness. That quiet sadness sitting just underneath the surface of every smile she ever gave in front of a camera. Because Audrey Hepburn was not born graceful. She was not handed elegance by a comfortable life. She earned that stillness the hard way. She earned it through years of loss, hunger, fear, and a silence that followed her from childhood all the way into her final days. The world saw a woman who seemed untouchable, perfectly composed, always kind, always present. What the world did not see was the girl underneath. A girl who had waited for her father to come back. A girl who had hidden in cellars while bombs fell above her. A girl who had danced on an empty stomach because dance was the only thing nobody could take from her. She won an Oscar. She won a Tony. She won a Grammy and an Emmy. She became one of the very few people in history to achieve all 4. She was on every magazine cover. Every designer wanted her name attached to their work. Hubert de Givenchy built an entire friendship around dressing her, and she wore his creations like they had been designed specifically for the shape of her sadness. But none of that is where this story really begins. This story begins in a house in Belgium, in a family that looked perfect from the outside, and with a father who one day walked out the door and never truly came back. What that one moment did to Audrey Hepburn is the reason you are watching this today. And once you understand it, nothing about her life will ever look the same again. Audrey Hepburn was born in Brussels in 1929. From the outside, her early life looked privileged. Her family had wealth, status, and connections. She moved between Belgium, England, and the Netherlands. By the time she was a young girl, she already spoke several languages. Her mother was a Dutch baroness. Her father was a British businessman. It seemed like the kind of childhood that gave a child every advantage. But behind the polished surface, something was already breaking. Her parents' marriage was unstable. They argued, drifted apart, and lived increasingly separate lives. Then, in 1935, when Audrey was only 6 years old, her father did something that would mark her forever. He left. Not quietly after a long conversation. He simply walked away from the family and moved to London. For a child, that kind of abandonment is a wound that does not heal easily. Audrey later said her father's leaving was one of the most painful events of her life. Even as an adult, she could not speak about it without feeling the old grief return. Her mother sent her to a boarding school in England. Audrey would watch other children leave for holidays with their parents. She waited, hoping her father would come. He had the right to visit her. But he never used it. The silence from him was louder than any argument could have been. Then the world itself began to collapse. In the late 1930s, war was spreading across Europe. Audrey's mother decided the Netherlands would be safer. So Audrey was sent there, to a country that soon became one of the most dangerous places in Europe. In 1940, German forces invaded the Netherlands. Audrey was only 10 years old. The life she had known vanished overnight. Food became scarce. Fear became constant. She was forced to change her name to something less English-sounding to avoid drawing attention. She went from being Audrey to being a girl named Edda. She survived bombings by hiding in cellars. She saw soldiers in the streets. She learned to stay quiet, move quickly, and trust very few people. In 1942, members of her own family were arrested and executed for their involvement in the resistance. The war was no longer something happening around her. It had entered her home, her blood, her deepest sense of safety. But Audrey refused to disappear. She began helping the Dutch resistance. She carried messages and underground newspapers, sometimes hiding them in her shoes. She also danced. Before the war, ballet had been her dream. Now it became something else. She performed at secret gatherings to raise money for the resistance. The rooms were dark. The audiences were silent. A single clap could have betrayed everyone. By 1944, famine had taken hold. That winter was freezing. German blockades cut off food. Audrey's family ate tulip bulbs and baked grass bread. Her body weakened. She became malnourished, anemic, and dangerously ill. When liberation finally came, aid workers arrived with food. One of them handed her a chocolate bar. It was a small thing. But for a girl who had been starving through a war, it felt like life itself. She never forgot that kindness. And she never forgot the man who left when she was 6. But what would you have done if you were a child in her position? Would you have kept fighting, or would the silence have broken you? Share your thoughts in the comments. When the war ended, Audrey Hepburn had nothing left but a dream. Her body was damaged. Her family was broken. The childhood she should have had was gone. But somewhere inside the girl who had danced in dark rooms for silent audiences, there was still a burning desire to perform, to be seen, to matter. So she chased it. She moved to London and began training seriously in ballet. She worked harder than almost anyone around her. But the years of malnutrition had taken a physical toll that no amount of training could fully repair. Her teachers told her gently but clearly that her body would never carry her to the top levels of professional ballet. For a girl whose only surviving dream was dance, that rejection cut deeply. But Audrey did not stop. She turned toward acting. Small theater roles. Minor appearances. Tiny parts in British films that nobody remembers today. She was not an overnight success. She was a young woman with hollow cheekbones, enormous eyes, and something in her presence that the camera seemed to feel even when the script gave her almost nothing to work with. Then came the moment that changed everything. The legendary French author Colette was casting for a Broadway production of her novel Gigi. She needed someone specific. Someone who felt both fragile and alive at the same time. When she saw Audrey, she reportedly pointed at her and said simply that she had found her Gigi. Broadway opened a door. Hollywood walked through it. Roman Holiday arrived in 1953. Audrey was cast opposite Gregory Peck, one of the biggest stars in the world at that time. Peck was generous enough to insist that her name appear equally on the credits, even though she was virtually unknown. When the film was released, it was Audrey who stopped people in their seats. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Just like that, the girl who had hidden in cellars was standing on the most famous stage in the world holding the film industry's highest honor. But success brought something she had not expected. It brought men who saw her fame before they saw her. On the set of Sabrina in 1954, she met William Holden. He was charming, warm, and completely captivated by her. The chemistry between them was real and everyone on set could see it. What began as closeness during filming became a genuine romantic connection. Holden fell hard. He told her so. He asked her to marry him. She said no. The reason was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Audrey wanted children more than almost anything else in the world. And Holden had already undergone a vasectomy. That was not something she could set aside no matter how real her feelings were. He never fully recovered from her answer. And Audrey moved forward, carrying the quiet weight of another person she had chosen to walk away from. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind the world's most iconic names, subscribe now because what comes next reveals the two relationships that would define her deepest pain. After Roman Holiday, Audrey Hepburn was the most wanted woman in Hollywood. Every director wanted her. Every studio wanted her name on their posters. She had fame, money, and a career that most actresses only dreamed about. But underneath all of it, something old and familiar was still missing. She wanted a home. She wanted stability. She wanted someone to stay. That desire, rooted so deeply in a 6-year-old girl who had watched her father walk away, would lead her into 2 marriages that hurt her in ways the public never fully understood. The first man was Mel Ferrer. They met through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s. Ferrer was cultured, multilingual, and deeply involved in the arts. He was also older than her, authoritative, and confident in a way that felt like safety to someone who had grown up without it. They were cast together in a stage production called Ondine, and whatever existed between them off-stage quickly became impossible to ignore. By September 1954, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. In the beginning, the partnership worked. Ferrer took an active interest in her career. He had opinions about which role she should take, how she should present herself publicly, and who she should spend her time with. Audrey, still finding her footing despite her enormous fame, welcomed his guidance. But guidance slowly became control. People close to the couple began to notice the change. Ferrer's involvement stopped feeling like support and started feeling like ownership. He had opinions about everything. He made decisions that should have been hers. The most famous woman in Hollywood was quietly shrinking inside her own marriage. And then came the losses that broke something in her completely. Audrey wanted children desperately. In 1955, she became pregnant for the first time and suffered a miscarriage. The grief was devastating. Then in 1959, while filming a movie called The Unforgiven, she was thrown from a horse during a scene. The fall broke her back. Weeks in hospital followed. And then another miscarriage. 2 lost pregnancies. A broken body. And a marriage that kept tightening around her like a slow-closing door. In 1960, she finally gave birth to her son Sean. For a brief moment, it felt like things might stabilize. She stepped back from acting for a full year and devoted herself entirely to motherhood. But the marriage kept eroding. Rumors of Ferrer's jealousy and controlling behavior grew louder among those who knew them. After 14 years, it ended. Audrey walked away exhausted. But she walked away. The second marriage seemed like a rescue. His name was Andrea Detti. She met him during a summer cruise in the Mediterranean in the late 1960s. He was an Italian psychiatrist, warm and charming in a way that felt like sunlight after years in a closed room. The setting was impossibly romantic. Blue water. Long evenings. No cameras. No pressure. Within 6 months, they were married. Audrey moved to Rome. She stepped back from Hollywood again. She wanted a quiet life, a second child, and a fresh beginning. In 1970, she gave birth to her son Luca. But Detti had a version of himself he had kept carefully hidden during those Mediterranean evenings. The affairs started early. They were not discreet. Reports of his relationships with other women became a regular feature in the Italian press. Audrey had left Hollywood to escape the intrusion of public life, only to find herself living inside a very different kind of humiliation. She stayed longer than most people expected. Partly for Luca. Partly because she was not someone who gave up on commitments easily. But eventually the weight became too much. The marriage ended quietly. 2 marriages. 2 very different kinds of pain. And underneath both of them, a pattern that had started long before either man ever entered her life. The real wound had never been about them at all. After the second divorce, people expected Audrey Hepburn to do what most celebrities do. Make a statement. Return to the spotlight. Announce a comeback. Use the cameras to rebuild an image that 2 failed marriages had quietly damaged. She did none of that. Instead, she disappeared. She moved to a small farmhouse in Tolekines, a quiet village in Switzerland. The house had a name. She called it La Paisible. In French, that means the peaceful one. The name was not accidental. It was a decision. A declaration. After decades of noise, control, betrayal, and public exposure, Audrey Hepburn had chosen silence. She turned down major film roles. She avoided Hollywood events. She spent her mornings in the garden, walked her dogs through the village, cooked simple meals, and lived in a way that the world would never have recognized as the life of one of its most famous women. Neighbors in Tolekines later said she was simply a neighbor. Someone who said good morning at the market. Someone who did not need to be anything more than present. But even in that silence, something unexpected was waiting. His name was Robert Wolders. They met at a charity event in the late 1970s. Wolders was a Dutch actor who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon, after a long illness. Their first meeting was quiet and unremarkable on the surface. He invited her somewhere shortly after. She declined because she had a prior commitment. But the following day, she reached out to him. She suggested they meet for a drink. That drink became a conversation that lasted hours. Those conversations became daily phone calls. And those phone calls became something neither of them had planned for or expected. What they built together was not glamorous. It was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no Hollywood romance, no public declarations. That was precisely what made it different from everything that had come before. Both of them had lived through enough loss. Enough relationships that had asked them to be smaller versions of themselves. What they offered each other was something neither had experienced fully before. Steadiness. Respect. Presence. Wolders traveled with her. He sat beside her at dinner tables and in airport lounges and in the quiet evenings at La Paisible when there was nothing to do except exist in the same space. He did not try to manage her. He did not try to shape her. He simply stayed. They never married formally. Audrey did not feel the need for paperwork. She introduced him as her partner in every way that mattered. The commitment was already complete without a ceremony. Everyone who knew them in those years said the same thing. They had never seen Audrey more at peace. Maybe everyone deserves one relationship that does not cost them anything. One person who stays not because of what you represent, but because of who you actually are. If you have ever found that kind of quiet love in your own life, or if you are still waiting for it, you already understand exactly what Audrey found in those years at La Paisible. But even as she finally found peace, something inside her was being called back. Not to Hollywood. Not to fame. To something far more important than either. In 1988, Audrey Hepburn attended a UNICEF concert. She went simply as a guest. No cameras were following her specifically. No press release had been prepared. She was just a woman in the audience, sitting quietly, watching a performance organized around the cause of helping children in crisis around the world. But something happened that evening that nobody planned. She was asked to speak. She walked onto the stage without a prepared script and began talking. About hunger. About occupation. About what it meant to be a child in wartime with no food, no safety, and no certainty that tomorrow would come. She spoke without notes because she did not need them. She had lived every word she was saying. A senior UNICEF official was in the audience that night. By the end of the evening, he had offered her a full ambassadorship. She accepted without hesitation. And just like that, the woman who had spent years building a quiet life away from public attention stepped back into the world. But this time it was completely on her own terms. This time it was not for fame or for a film or for anyone else's approval. This time it was personal. The missions that followed took her to some of the most difficult places on earth. Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, El Salvador, Guatemala, Somalia. She sat in refugee camps and field hospitals and villages where children had not eaten in days. She held babies whose arms were thinner than her fingers. She looked into the faces of mothers who had walked for weeks through dangerous territory just to find food for their children. Those who traveled with her on these missions consistently said the same thing. She did not treat it as an obligation. She did not treat it as a performance of generosity for the cameras. She treated it as something unfinished. Something she personally owed. Because she knew exactly what those children were feeling. She had been one of them. The girl who had eaten tulip bulbs during a freezing Dutch winter. The girl who had danced on an empty stomach in silent rooms. The girl who had received a chocolate bar from an aid worker after liberation and never forgotten the feeling of being seen by a stranger who chose to help. That girl never left her. Robert Wolders traveled with her on many of these missions. He was not there as a manager or a handler. He was there because he refused to let her face the hardest moments alone. In photographs from those trips, you can sometimes see him standing just slightly behind her. Present. Steady. Exactly where he always was. In 1992, after returning from a particularly difficult mission in Somalia, Audrey began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Tests were run. Results came back. The diagnosis was a rare and aggressive form of cancer. It had already spread further than the doctors had hoped. She absorbed the news quietly. Those around her said she did not collapse. She did not rage. What she expressed most in those first conversations was not fear of dying. It was regret about the work she would not be able to finish. But even now, facing the end, there was still one thing left unresolved. One name she kept returning to. One wound that no amount of peace, no amount of love, and no amount of meaningful work had ever fully closed. And she was finally ready to speak about it. When the cancer diagnosis came, Audrey Hepburn made one request. She wanted to go home. She was too fragile to travel commercially. It was Hubert de Givenchy, her closest friend of nearly 40 years, who arranged a private jet and made the journey possible. She arrived back at La Paisible in December of 1992. She spent her final Christmas there, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her. Robert Wolders was there. Her sons Sean and Luca were there. Givenchy was there. In a gesture that everyone who was present described as quietly typical of who she was, she gave each of the three men closest to her a winter coat. Not jewelry. Not something expensive or showy. Something warm. Something that would protect them after she was gone. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn died peacefully at home. She was 63 years old. Her funeral was held at the small local church in Tolkienaz. Gregory Peck, the man who had insisted she receive equal billing on Roman holiday 4 decades earlier when she was completely unknown, stood up and read one of her favorite poems. Her former husbands were present. Her sons were present. Robert Wolders stood among them. The village she had chosen for its silence gave her a quiet farewell. But before she died, in the interviews and private conversations of her final years, Audrey returned again and again to one person. Not Mel Ferrer. Not Andrea Ditti. Not William Holden. Not even Robert Wolders, the man who had finally given her the peace she had spent her whole life searching for. She returned to her father, Joseph Rustin, the man who had left when she was 6 years old and never truly come back. In those final months, people who sat with her described how she spoke about him. Not with bitterness. Audrey was not built for sustained bitterness, but with a kind of quiet, unresolved wondering that had never gone away no matter how much time had passed. She wondered what he had been thinking when he left. She wondered whether he had ever felt the absence the way she had. Whether somewhere inside him there had been something real that he simply did not know how to express. She never got a satisfying answer. She had tracked him down through the Red Cross in the 1960s. He had been living quietly in Dublin. She had approached that reunion carrying decades of hope. What she found was a man who offered almost nothing in return. He was distant, emotionally unavailable. The warmth she had imagined through all those years of waiting simply was not there. But she forgave him anyway. More than that, she supported him financially for the rest of his life. That single detail says more about Audrey Hepburn than any film she ever made. Biographers and people close to her have made the case that every major emotional decision she made traces back to that original wound. The older men she was drawn to. The authoritative figures she mistook for stability. The willingness to stay in relationships long past the point they had stopped working. The way she devoted her final years to children in crisis, children who had lost the structures they depended on. All of it carried the shape of something personal. She once said in one of her most remembered interviews that the best thing you could ever leave your children was the feeling of being loved. It was a simple sentence. But given everything she had lived through, it was also the most honest thing she ever said in public. It was the thing she had needed most. It was the thing she had received least. And it was the thing she spent the rest of her life trying to give to everyone around her. Her sons. The children she met in refugee camps. The strangers who handed her letters at airports. Every single person who looked up at her and needed something they could not quite name. Robert Wolders, who knew her better in her final decade than almost anyone alive, said afterward that what struck him most about Audrey was not her beauty or her talent or the way she moved through a room. It was her capacity for forgiveness. Not the easy kind. Not the kind that costs you nothing. The kind that requires you to keep loving someone who gave you almost no reason to. The kind that asks you to carry a wound quietly for 60 years and still choose grace over anger every single morning. She never stopped loving her father. She never stopped grieving him either. And in that long, unresolved space between loving someone and being hurt by them, is perhaps the most honest portrait anyone has ever drawn of who Audrey Hepburn really was beneath the elegance, beneath the pearls, beneath the perfectly composed smile that the whole world fell in love with. She was a girl who had waited for someone to come back. And she spent her entire life making sure nobody around her ever had to feel that same waiting. Maybe that is the greatest thing any person can do with their pain. Not hide it. Not perform it. But quietly transform it into something that reaches out and holds someone else up. Audrey Hepburn did exactly that. And the world is still feeling it. In our next documentary, we explore another beloved icon whose public image hit a private battle that almost broke them completely. A story of loss, reinvention, and a comeback that nobody saw coming. Click on the next video and discover the story that changed everything.